Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the panel that's going to be speaking about displaced people in the world. And on the panel, we have Stefanie Plant, who's with the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, as well as Manal Kahi, who's with Offbeat, a locally based company well, she'll tell you more. I won't spoil it. We're going to be talking about the trends that are happening with displaced people around the world and what these two organizations are doing to respond to this movement and growth of displaced people. As some of you may know, we're really in a crisis situation where people are moving from their homes. They're having to move from their homes to other towns, cities, states, and more countries. It could be driven by climate change, could be driven by wars. Often, at least to the south of this country, we're seeing a lot due to violence and lack of economic opportunity. I'm not the expert, but I will pass over to these two, and in the course of the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to have a dialogue, a conversation. Then I certainly want to have plenty of time to open it up to all of you to ask your questions. Hopefully both personal and professional, if you don't mind. And if you do, you can take a pass. But we want to go deep on this because it's a real epidemic, it's a real crisis. And so let me first start with Stefanie. With the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, I think your organization, I don't know how many years it's been operating, but it's been for a long time. How do you define displaced people or displaced persons, just so that we're all on the same page? And how do they differ from refugees?
So hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing our panel over the others. It'll be the best. So IRC is a global humanitarian organization. We actually say that we are primarily a refugee organization, but displacement to us really is transnational. So you might have heard stats such as, I think now there's about 27 million refugees in the world. And so that would be people who have had to flee their home country because of either conflict or crisis. So you might have also heard of, for example, climate refugees, as well as refugees fleeing from instability from armed groups, many of whom wind up in dedicated refugee camps that are organized and managed by the UN in conjunction with host country governments. But there's also a category of people that we routinely work with, which we refer to as IDPs, or internally displaced people. And so that almost doubles the number of displaced people. So if there's about 30 million refugees, there's also about 30 million displaced persons who have been forced out of their homes, out of their villages. They might still be in the same country, but it's as if all of us here in New York faced some sort of a crisis and had to flee towards the West Coast, and we didn't have family there and we didn't know people there. We would still be displaced peoples, and we would still need support and services because we might have had to flee with nothing but the clothes on our back. So IRC tries to work with both these populations, as well as sometimes vulnerable host community members, so people who have not been displaced but are generally still in dire straits.
Great. By the way, here's your water. Thank you. And before we get too deep on what each of your organizations do, could you also talk about how is this the rate of displaced people, how has it changed over the last 5 years, Stefanie? And what do you predict it to be in the next 20 years?
It is increasing. I think everyone's probably pretty aware of a lot of conflicts in the past 5 or more years across the Middle East, especially like climate refugees being driven by increasing drought and other issues across, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa. So the numbers are going up. I believe a few years ago that the number of refugees, for example, was closer to 20 million. Now it's closer to 30 million. And what you're hearing in the news daily is creating more refugees, more IDPs. So, for example, the the
IDP,
escalating crisis. Oh,
what's the
sorry,
IDP?
Internally displaced people. So what you've heard on the news in the past few days, even about the Turkish incursion into Syria, and obviously that's politically fraught. I think that the update that I received yesterday was that there are 60,000 people that displaced in the past day or two from that, fleeing from the closer to the border in Syria, deeper into the country. So that is an example. It's probably closer to 100,000 by today. And that's an example of internally displaced people. And that's across 2 or 3 days.
Wow. Okay, so the numbers in certain regions especially are escalating. Do you see, of all that, I mentioned at the beginning, climate change, wars, economic opportunity, why people leave their homes. What do you see as, in the future, the greatest root cause is going to be?
So I would say, and I'm not a political scientist, so this is borrowed information from colleagues and people in the sector who are, but at least across the next decade or two, there's a political issue, and then I think in the larger scale, thinking, 3, 4, 5 decades and onward, there's another factor, and they're both going to increase the number of displaced people and refugees. More recently, we've seen this rise of nationalism across a number of countries, of these in-group, out-group biases, of unwillingness here in the US, but also in a lot of Western countries and other countries, to be less willing to accept those in dire straits, those fleeing. And something that you all might not be aware of is, of the top 10 refugee hosting countries in the world, I believe 8 of them are not what we would consider Western countries. They're Ethiopia hosting Somalis. It's Tanzania hosting South Sudanese refugees. And that's funny to a lot of people, because if you think of, or you've maybe traveled and experienced some, poor villages in Ethiopia and Tanzania, in these places, you realize that even those citizens are pretty vulnerable and probably could use international aid and support. And so then imagine those countries with a lot of their own people like that having to deal with these influxes of refugees. And so in those places as well, you get a lot of pushback. So we have a lot of people fleeing from various causes, and less acceptance from those who are from a little bit better off to a lot better off to be willing to accept these people. And this also relates to funding streams from the US, from the UK, EU, traditional donors. Some of the narratives are shifting. The funding picture is becoming a bit more complex for us. And the narrative is changing, so maybe money that used to be pretty expensive and earmarked for youth employment development in East Africa from USAID, now the calls for proposals to fund projects that are coming out are framed more around countering terrorism and those sort of things. So you're seeing more of a political bent, which can constrain a little bit which people we serve and how we structure our programs. So that's the more immediate effect. And then the longer effect, as I referred to, is climate change, which maybe our White House is disavowing at this moment, but we've seen it on the ground. It's a reality to many people. The millions of people who live agrarian lives are and have been affected day to day for many years already by this, and the extremes are getting more extreme.
I vouch for that. I grew up on a 4th generation family farm, and this year the flooding has really wiped out 30% of the area's land and crops. So yes, and that's just here. Manal, I want to turn to you and then have both of you guys, if you can summarize in less than 30 seconds. What does your organization do?
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Manal Kahi. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Eat Offbeat. We at Eat Offbeat are a catering company that is introducing New Yorkers to new and off the beaten path cuisines from all around the world. We basically hire talented home cooks who happen to be refugees by status. They are really chefs by calling. We train them to become professional chefs by nature or by trade, and then we deliver their food to groups of 10 people up to 1,000 all over New York City. We mostly do corporate catering, but we also cater gala events or all sorts of events all across New York City.
Brilliant. And on that, actually, Stefanie, can you just give a 30-second too about the IRC? I think you described a little bit, but if you could just...
Sure. So we're a global humanitarian organization. We're in just over 40 international countries where there are refugees or internally displaced people. And we also have a U.S. refugee resettlement side of the organization that is in, I think, 20 U.S. cities now. So we basically cover the continuum from helping accept and health screen and provide basic needs to people coming across a border to become refugees, to working with them and providing a suite of services in camps. And then we follow the continuum when people are selected for placement in the US, in one of the cities where we have a presence. We will have people who meet them at the airport the first time they've ever set foot out of their country or their continent, and get them set up with the basics, with housing, with job training, get the kids enrolled in school. So we follow follow those individuals sometimes for many years.
And now you're partners.
Yeah, I was going to add, so we're actually partners with the IRC, with the New York office, and that's how we do our hiring. So all of our chefs are referred to us by the IRC, the New York office. That's kind of how we do all of our hiring, mostly for the chefs and the delivery team.
So this is brilliant because you have the great case study here on one ways that the continuum, as you said. Manal, I want to turn to you about misconceptions that you're seeing. You yourself, you're coming home actually to Columbia in a way, right? You came from Lebanon and became a SEPA student, where you kind of got the idea, if I read correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And here you are, so welcome back.
Thank you.
What are you seeing as misconceptions that are out there around the world with refugees or displaced persons, and how can we, and even as individuals, help combat that?
So clearly, I mean, I will be answering this from our own experience, right, which is very New York-centric, which is very local to here. So it's not necessarily representative of the global situation, which I think Stefanie might have much more to say about. But a few things we've noticed in terms of misconceptions, at least with our chefs or with the team we work with today. You know, when you come as a refugee, you lose so many things, and clearly there's this idea that you're vulnerable, you're needy, you might need charity, and that is the case for many people. It's clearly the case for most people who first arrive here over the first few months until you kind of get on your feet, and that's where the IRC and other organizations do so much great work in kind of helping people. You know, when you have no one in town, when you practically don't speak the language, where do you leave your kids if you need to go find work? All of these things that are really hard to do. But the main misconception or main perception we've seen that has been, I wouldn't say hurting, but I did hear many of our chefs actually complain about, is the fact that they're immediately put in a bucket of someone who's vulnerable and someone who needs help. And sometimes, especially when you're coming from a background where you grew up your entire life in maybe a wealthy background or a middle-class background, right? Or you were in a very different status, right? It makes it much harder to kind of see yourself and accept the image you kind of have in this country. So that's one of the things we have seen happen here, at least in New York. And the way we try to combat that is, for us, really, I mean, we as a company have three goals. The first is to hire the first is to create quality jobs. The second is to build bridges between us cooking at the kitchen and people having our food at their office or at home. And the third is really to change the narrative around refugees by showcasing a different and a more positive story. And this is really where the issue of perception comes in, because for us, you know, we're a company where refugees are the chefs, they are the heroes, they are the ones helping New Yorkers and not the other way around. We're not a charity, we never position ourselves as a charity, we're a for-profit company, and it's all about showcasing, you know, a case where refugees, in this case, are really helping New York discover something new and kind of go off the beaten path and not necessarily rely on charity. In fact, they are active employees, they are paying their taxes, they are active contributors to the economy. Not only are they contributing to the economy, but they're actually bringing value to the city and bringing a more rich, right, and enriching kind of the food, the culinary scene in the city. So let's
go down that path a little bit more, Manal. First of all, you know, macroeconomics shows that having refugees in your economy actually has the economy surge as far as the GDP. I don't know why we can't seem to accept that in a lot of our places, but it's such an asset, right, to have that, and you're showing that how you can. It's a win-win for everyone, right? Tell us how you, besides working with IRC, how else did you come about building your team? And then secondly, how did you get the financing?
I start with the financing. It's it's the easier part. We really started thanks to the Tamer Fund for Social Venture. So that's kind of it's coincidentally it's great that we got our first grant for $25,000 in 2015 before we started anything, before we even had a kitchen to go to, right? So that was really what got us started. Without that, I don't think we would have been anywhere, because it has been, since then, it has been really a challenge to secure funding elsewhere. And maybe I'll touch on that in a little bit if we talk about challenges. I'll tell you a bit more about why that has been a challenge. But basically, we have been able to secure funding mostly through either business competitions in the very early stages. We also won the WeWork Creator Awards. So that was a total of $360,000 that also, again, clearly got us much farther.
Go ahead and speak to the challenges.
Sure.
You as an immigrant in this country, I want to hear what have you been bumping up against in order to get funding to have your incredible business grow?
I rarely think of a challenge as an immigrant, because I honestly, I don't think I get more challenges because I'm an immigrant, maybe on a personal level more than anything else. But I think maybe we as a business we clearly face the same challenges as any food startup or as any startup starting: access to capital, figuring out the right logistics, marketing. I won't go into those, right? They're kind of similar. I'm sure you hear about those all the time. But one challenge we as a company have been facing that's really more intrinsic to our model, I would say, is the challenge of perception. And that is, we face challenges on 3 levels, I would say. The first is with perception from investors or from potential investors. Immediately, as soon as I pitch what we do, we immediately get put in a bucket of either a nonprofit or, sure, for-profit, but not necessarily as profitable or as competitive as any other business, right? And if you look at the numbers, you'll see we're actually more competitive because we don't need to do marketing. It's word of mouth is just embedded in our model.
And when you mentioned Chobani, the yogurt, right?
Yeah.
Similar model, right? Using refugees or no? Is that something
in some
that
cases,
that
they're
convinces them?
Such a different scale. Shobani succeeded first selling yogurt, and then he started hiring refugees because he was personally invested in the cause. So it wasn't really the model
built in from the ground zero, yeah.
Exactly. So this is where it's a bit different, but it's hard to convince. But maybe that's a good example. I should mention a bit more with investors. But then again, I say perception because that's the first impression is already there, right? You can prove all the data after, but it's hard to go against the first impression. The second level, I would say, where that becomes a challenge is similarly with potential customers. Again, maybe even people in this room, right? They hear about us, like, oh, wow, this is brilliant, this is great. I should put them in touch with our CSR department. I'm like, no, put us in touch with the office manager. We sell food, right? We're not a CSR initiative. We're a food company. We're gonna give you great food. Plus, that's also impactful. So maybe your CSR department will be happy about it, but it's not necessarily them that we need to talk about. And a third level is more internal, I would say, more on marketing. So I think that has been my biggest fear all throughout. How do you make sure to communicate? Clearly, we need to communicate what we do. We need to communicate we're immigrants, we're refugees. But how do you do that all the while respecting your chefs and all the while respecting the team we're working with and without taking advantage of people, right, or of people's statuses? And without, again, I mentioned the issue of, that I mentioned earlier, of perception, misconceptions. So how do we do that all the while we're protecting our team, I would say, and without taking advantage of them? And that has been a challenge on communication and marketing, because marketers are really hard to work with.
Would you be open to any support from the audience if there are people that could help tackle those 3 challenges?
Absolutely. I need a way to get over to say what we do without saying refugee chefs. So if anyone has ideas on, I always say we are chefs by nature, we are refugees by status, chefs by calling, or chefs by nature. So that's one way, but it doesn't always work. So if anyone has ideas, please definitely let me know.
That's a call to action for any of you out there, students too, if you're looking for projects. Great. For both you, and Stefanie, I'll start with you. I want to get into, now let's get personal. What were your motivations to actually do the work and get involved with IRC? Where did that come from? Tell me about a little bit about you and what motivated you?
So perhaps like many of you, since we're at the business school here, I had a private sector background. I'm a Booth MBA, so sorry. But, that being said, my family has a history of service. My father was in the military, my grandfather was, so there's like this theme of service. My mother is huge in volunteerism. And I too had been involved with, from high school, like UNICEF and our, just different pro bono nonprofit consulting when I was earlier in my career and whatnot. And at some point, just making money for the man and myself did not hit me where I wanted it to. So I made the leap, and personally, I started with the pro bono consulting. I went overseas. I was working with a number of grassroots organizations just as an independent consultant. I also worked for a for-profit boutique consultancy that consults to major nonprofits, so kind of pivoted that way, and then worked for a very small NGO that focused exclusively on health infrastructure in Tanzania before making the transition to IRC, where I'm leveraging my background. I'm an economics undergrad. I have my MBA, operations and private sector experience, and now I apply that because I am an enterprise development and employment technical advisor within one of our key sectors of delivery, which is economic recovery and development. So IRC does health, we do education work, we do human rights and empowerment, a lot of protection work, and the fifth pillar is economic recovery and development. So it behooves us to have practitioners who can think from that private sector perspective, who have worked with companies and organizations and then can help make the links between how they recruit and what they're looking for, and what skills we can help build within refugees and IDPs to help eradicate any gaps.
What causes you to really wake up and do this every day?
My alarm clock.
That's not fair.
I know. No, it really is. So I'm very privileged in that I split my time between our headquarters here in New York and doing field visits to our country offices, which are actually mostly staffed by top folks. Like our Ethiopia office is staffed by Ethiopians. We've got mostly Iraqis working in our Iraq office, but we try and create this global standard and share global best practices and tools. And our technical advisors, among which I'm one, we kind of help disseminate tools and best practices and help train new staff. And when I go to the field, a lot of times we're then taking a IRC vehicle 4 hours to a remote village where we've had a project for a few years. And I'm sitting in on, for example, a village savings and loan meeting. So you've got these 25 women who, dress in their best fancy clothes, which are not as we'd view fancy, because they know that a visitor's coming, and they're saving in amounts of money that to you and I is less than we pay for a coffee here. And that's what they're saving each month. And they're just so gracious. And then they share stories. They're like, I was able to get a business off the ground, baking cakes and whatnot. And I'm now able to send my 2 children to school because that little amount of money actually goes really far in those contexts. And I just float high off of those, those end beneficiary visits for so long, because we really, in the end, are drilling down to the ground. It's not just high-level advocacy. You could theoretically count the number of lives, the number of households that IRC's global work, and all of our peers in the sector and all of the social enterprises, the number of people's lives that have been changed in many different ways.
So impact.
Right.
Manal, wasn't too many years ago you were sitting out here, right?
Right, 5 years ago.
And you had a fork in the road, right? You could have probably jumped in any company, perhaps of your choice. Why? What motivated you to roll up your sleeves and go in the trenches and start something, which is not easy?
I think initially it was more of a why not rather than a why. It was really, I was graduating, I was still a student, on my second year, and clearly I could have found a job, but I was like, why not try this? We had this idea to start the business, and the stakes were low. When you're a student, for any students here, take advantage of this time because you're already on a student budget. You could probably live another 6 months on a student budget, or maybe even less. When you're an entrepreneur beginning, you're going to be on even lower than a student budget. The stakes are low. I kept thinking to myself, either I find a job now, or I find it in 6 months after I've failed, or maybe tried something and failed at it, and could probably use that failure as something on my resume, right? Or to find a different job. So it was really, I think, more of a why not than a why.
Got it. For both of you guys, if you could pick one thing that you think would reverse this increase in displaced people, or at least slow the rate the most, what would it be? Stefanie? What one thing? You can only pick one.
Such a hard question.
Yeah, do you want to go first? I'm fine passing.
You're the expert.
The most
I would
effective.
say I'm applying for a green card now, so I don't know if I should maybe
Can we
avoid
turn off the
answering that
recording for a
question.
moment?
Yeah, we can stop the recording for a second. Say what you feel comfortable.
I mean, we're talking about one thing that could reduce the flow
that could
of
reduce the increase of displaced people around the world. If there were one lever you could pull that would either reverse and or stop and or greatly reduce, what would it be?
I mean, I want to give the kind of hippie answer, which is like, we have to view people that are different from ourselves as like one and the same and accept them, as our neighbor when they, flee to us. And that is very, very true. But that has to translate politically. And I guess at a very high level, I'm sure many of you are activists in many ways in your lives, but it's really about the advocacy, politically through whatever level that you can access, because what it comes down to is really like high-level governments talking to high-level governments about levers and funding and things that will take care of refugees and, prevent political instability that creates them. So when you hear these horrifying things going on in the news, contact your elected representatives and say, this is, completely ridiculous. Because if enough of us raise our voices, I think it can make a difference, because the problem that IRC has and so many of our peers is that we're getting it downstream, right? We are dealing with the effects that happen after those political conversations and those crises happen. So we would love to be out of business, right? We would love to not have these huge influxes of people that we have to support and help. But we have less control over the source, and I think like it's a very distributed responsibility for all of us together, no matter where we're from, to make our voices heard and push for the prevention of this. But until that's able to happen, we will all be working to deal with the aftermath of these problems.
So I heard two levers.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. One is again accepting, that we're all equal, if you will, embracing. But it sounds like the second, would you be fair to say, obviously it's political, but could that be policy change?
Right. It's legislating. It's making one's voice heard to help influence policy change, and the policy change ties into like that openness. That why do we need to cut the number of refugees that we're willing to accept down to whatever the horrifyingly low number was, 15,000, 10,000, something ridiculous. When, as we were speaking about earlier, there are proven benefits to letting these strivers in. It's not like they're all just going to go on the dole. It's that these people want to integrate. They're forced to flee, but they want to make the best of the situation. They want to work. They don't want your handouts. And so I think that the narrative of we are all the same and we are all neighbors, and reframing that like, would you want to just live off of welfare? No. And they're no different. So making that analogy that we are all the same, it then ties into the political impetus and the policy change. These are not, let's let refugees in. This, hell, the U.S. was built on refugees. Why were, European refugees 70 to 100 years ago any different from Middle Eastern refugees today?
Manal, before I turn to you, I just want to say, if anyone's interested, Alexander Betts, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's from the University of Oxford. He's done a lot of work in this space showing the benefits of refugees in your economy. So feel free to check that out. Manal, okay, the one lever?
Yeah,
that
I
you
was
would-
gonna attack like the political factors, but I think beyond that, I think it's just really at the root cause a better distribution of wealth and resources, because that's really, people are not fleeing because they want to. Very often you're leaving a lot behind and you really don't want to do that. If you had access to the proper resources, security, safety, you wouldn't flee. So I think really it's a hard lever to pull. It's not like an easy thing to solve, but that would be.
Great. I'll ask one more question before I open up to all of you. So get your questions ready. I totally concur with what you just said. What some people don't know here, I used to be in the Peace Corps in a country called Togo, West Africa, in the middle of nowhere. But my brother ended up having to flee because he was under a dictator and he spoke out. So I totally get it. He slept on my sofa for a year and a half before he ended up getting a job, and he flew into JFK with $60 in his pocket, not knowing the language and having to get across town to Penn Station, if you can imagine, up to Cornell. So I've seen it, and I've seen the courage, and now he's working at Berkeley, and he's doing wonderfully, giving back to the economy, much better than I am in many ways, as far as what he's doing. So I totally admire what you all are doing for displaced people. Question for you guys on what's the greatest challenge each of your organizations are facing in being able to make the most impact possible? Whoever would like to go first. What's the greatest? So one thing that's really, if you could just blast it open, you feel like you'd make a lot more impact in your organization.
For us, it's really truncated funding and shrinking envelopes.
And where do you get your funding? Can you let us know that?
So IRC, being a large multinational organization, I believe it used to be at least like 70 or 80% of our funding was from governments and multinationals like European Commission, USAID, DFID, and then the rest was from private fundraising. We've been consciously trying to shift that to make it more equal because it means we're dealing less with the vagaries of politics. But as I mentioned, as political opinions change, there's kind of a nationalist, anti-global, anti-refugee sentiment that's happening. So we have seen smaller funding envelopes from different national budgets, not just our own. And also just short funding horizons has always been an issue. So when you're trying to create systems change, when you're trying to, start someone from a point where they didn't complete secondary education and get them to a point where they have the knowledge and skills and complementary support and training and capital that they can launch a business in a country they've fled to or something, that's definitely a multi-year proposition. And we are more often than not dealing with humanitarian funding streams, development funding streams that are like, hey, 3 years is good. And that's really hard to deal with. And unless we can, peg funding after funding and make it continuous, which is a difficult dance to always do. We start up and we do great work with programs, and then really before we can kind of dot the I's and cross the T's to make sure that the changes that we're working towards can last, we're kind of forced out because that's the end of a grant. So we do a lot of advocacy with donors around this because we don't want to be a permanent agent in these environments. Like we try and work with private sector, we try and feed into sustainable organizations and actors and stakeholders that will be there, but sometimes that takes 10 years presence or more before you can sustainably hand over programming and a lot of the activities.
Great. Manal.
On our end right now, I think two things that would unlock, you did want one, but I think it goes hand in hand. We've been growing over the past 3 to 4 years, and now we're really ready to scale, and for that we're going to need money. So it's really capital that could help us increase our impact.
What kind of capital are you looking for?
We're looking at a combination of convertible notes and debt financing right now. So we're looking at $500,000. We're raising $500,000.
Impact
right
investors or general VCs, angels?
No VCs. We're definitely not VC ready. Our model is not necessarily the scalable type or the VC type of models, but we're more looking at angel investors or impact investors whenever that works, or restaurant investors. So if you know of anyone who's willing to invest in restaurants, that's kind of where the easiest capital that we could have access to. Another thing, though, that's way easier than investors is pure sales, customers. So that's actually sometimes even better than pure funds, right? All we need to do is sell more so that we could be, you know,
You're B2C though, right? You're going right to the
mostly
consumer?
B2B.
Mostly
We mostly
B2B.
do corporate catering. So the
Interesting.
bulk of what we do is actually team meetings, office lunches, faculty meetings,
Yes.
gala
We
dinners for
benefit.
nonprofits, benefits, but we do a lot of corporate catering. So really it's more of a B2B situation where we're looking for more companies to be on our radar.
Fantastic. Let's open it up to the audience, to all of you. Please feel free to ask your questions of anyone specifically. Looks like we have quite a few. Thanks, Ellie.
Hi, my name is Shaun. I have a consulting firm and also a foundation I recently started. And I guess I would consider myself a small, medium enterprise, although I'm still growing. And it sounds like a lot of what you were saying with the IRC that could be solved, or a solution to a lot of the issues that you were talking about could be in-kind services brought to you by smaller organizations. I know that you probably tend to work with a lot of larger institutions, but I'm wondering how can us in the smaller sector support you with in-kind services, because I'm also thinking about going into the space of, so basically what I do is I offer consulting services to aspiring entrepreneurs in the African diaspora. So people who are going back to the continent to build social enterprises there. And so I would love to see how I could support you in kind or in general, like what are ways that small, medium enterprises can support your work?
Well, IRC has its two faces. We have the U.S. program side, and I know you partnered with us, and also maybe you can speak more to that side. But for the international program side, we always are looking for partners, either who are philanthropic or ones that when we do get a funding opportunity, we can write in as part of our activities and our sports. So when we have helped incubate entrepreneurs in a lot of these contexts, we have a basic training package that we provide that was developed in-house, and we're having community-based trainers often provide this support. But then once the businesses start to grow, we do seek better ways to provide business development services to those entrepreneurs. And a lot of times it has to be kind of customized and unique to the different businesses that the refugees or others have launched. So, you know, I'd love to speak to you after. Sometimes it's hard for us to identify the best local providers of those services. So it really mostly is up to our folks on the ground doing their networking within these countries. But when there is a consultancy or an organization like yours that might be in like multiple countries or something, it's opportunistic events like this and membership in different sector specific membership groups like SEEP and DevX and those sort of organizations that can create ties like this. So let's talk after, and I'm also happy to talk about like any other sector or associations, membership groups, if anyone's interested after.
Great. Do you mind passing the right behind you? There's a few questions, and then we'll move over to the other side of the aisle.
Hi. My question is to Stefanie. Can you elaborate on your enterprise development initiatives? So, which geographies are you have you started with the incubators you mentioned? And what kind of business development services again are you providing these ventures, and what is the scale of these ventures? Thank you.
So first of all, the geographies that we're in where we like help incubate these businesses and provide business and life skills and financial literacy integrated training, they really span the globe. So we've done a lot of this in the Middle East with Syrian refugees in the past half a decade. Also, historically, in more of our development than humanitarian context. So I've worked a lot in East Africa, some of the Central and West African countries like Congo, like Nigeria, Niger, Sierra Leone, Liberia, who are coming out of Sierra Leone and Liberia, at least, coming out of the Ebola crisis. We're in those places. So once the basic humanitarian needs have stabilized, we try and create a bridge from that, basic cash assistance and whatnot, to then training, vocational training, and support capital provision in the form of business grants to help people, first of all, get the basic skills. They're guided by our staff to help form basic business plans. So we're talking like micro-sized businesses here. And then depending on the context, they might receive a grant of the equivalent of a few hundred US to like 5,000 US. To cover the initial costs and launch those businesses. So a lot of times support is centralized in a model wherein we set up basically an employment services center called a livelihood center. If we're working in more urban areas, that's kind of a one-stop shop for whatever training or support that you might need, because the people that we work with, especially like Syrian refugees, some people fled and they had been entrepreneurs in their home countries and they had college degrees. And some people fled and they hadn't finished secondary school. They were from remote areas, and so starting points were very different. So through employment centers or entrepreneurship centers, these livelihood centers, we can kind of customize individual pathways to success, if you will. And so we help them incubate these micro businesses. We monitor them for as long as we can. In the ideal situation, it's a long grant. We're supporting these entrepreneurs for the next 3 or 4 years. If it's a shorter grant, we work with them and help them troubleshoot initial micro entrepreneurship challenges for maybe like 6 months or something. But in the medium to long-term scenario, that's where, as their businesses start to scale, as they think about opening up the second location, or should I add another product line or whatnot, that's where some of these BDS services come in that are a little more customized, that are not just, hey, here's how to set up a basic ledger sheet. It's more about thinking about market share, thinking about supply chain issues, how you can cut costs, things like this. So it's really variety of packages of support, and we mostly will kind of be stepping out when and away, and saying fare thee well, when these businesses have grown to, small and medium enterprise side, and that's because IRC at least mostly is humanitarian to early development. Some other agencies like a TechnoServe or something might be more of development focused and work with more of the existing small businesses to help them scale up.
Stefanie, is it fair to assume you're just working with individuals who already have their legal status in the United States, or can they be not yet with papers and still go and be able to access your programs?
Well, I was speaking more internationally because that's where my experience sits. So if I can answer for a second, internationally, we encourage people to follow the letter of the law in the country where they are. That being said, it's nebulous and bribey and other things in a lot of these countries. So we basically just are providing the skills and the knowledge. Most people would be registered as refugees. If they're not, we're still going to be providing them the knowledge and whatnot so that they can have recourse to income.
So to IRC, it doesn't matter. You kind of turn a blind eye to that. You'll whoever comes your way, you would work with.
Yes, for the most part, and we will take an active role and or seek out legal assistance partners who will work with the refugees or the IDPs who don't have papers and status to get them, right? Okay. It really depends on the context. If they're already in a refugee camp, they have papers. If they are a refugee that's in an urban slum and trying to remain under the radar, we will accept them if they're the right target beneficiary, and as I said, we'll provide them the training stuff. In the U.S., if they're being resettled here, they will have papers. They're legal for the most part.
I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. Other questions?
Hi. My name's Courtney Johnson. I actually used to work for PRM, so I was with the State Department for years.
What's PRM stand for?
Population, Refugees, and Migration. So we're one of the world's largest donors for humanitarian response for refugees, provide a lot of money to IRC, worked and managed your programs. So many thoughts on all of these topics. I also was based in southeastern Turkey for 2 years, working on the Syrian refugee response as a RefCord. So my question for you guys is, we're talking about displacement, forced displacement, but what are your thoughts on economic migration and like what's happening on our own border, like looking at Venezuela? Because like the way that I think about it is like the movement of people is only going to continue to escalate, and it's like, everything else is just like terminology, and so like I think when it comes to policy and like looking at what we need to do to solve the problem, going back to your question, it's like this is the new norm. Like how do we want to address this globally? So thoughts.
Good point. Great question. Ladies.
I have much less to say on the macro political situation, but I think my approach is always the more human one. When people are in when people are in need, we need to find a way to help them. Like that's really my short answer, and I think that should trickle down into policy.
To me, it really speaks to open investment in neighboring countries, in countries in need, whether it's from a humanitarian perspective or like an economic policy perspective, because if you don't want people to come to a place where they see more opportunity and resources, then you have to invest in building up the opportunities and resources where they currently are. And, depending on the administration and whatnot, we've been better or worse at that vis-a-vis different countries, but it's really like investment and support of, third world, developing world, whatever you want to call it.
I think there's a question over here, but just following up as we're passing the baton. To your point, if this is the new normal, how do we cope? And it gets back to values too, that Manal was pointing out. Who are we? Who are we as individuals? Who are we as a country? And what are our values? Are we going to stand by that?
Thank you so much for speaking today. I had a question for you. It's interesting looking at a lot of these different enterprises that have been introduced today that really are looking to scale very large, sometimes seem to be the magic bullet solution for things, may seem like the next Silicon Valley unicorn, but the way you're approaching this is a little bit different in terms of your idea of scaling. And so I was wondering how you're envisioning yourself to be able to scale in the way that you like, if you ever look at different ways to potentially scale, like be like a Chobani or be like a Lenwich or something like that. It's because I think what you're doing too is like to address these kinds of problems with providing refugees jobs. You don't necessarily have to be this gigantic business to be able to make this really important impact. And for you to be able to make that impact, sometimes it's more efficient. It's better to be smaller. So I was wondering how you usually answer that kind of question when that's presented to you.
Yeah, I love that, because this is right where I'm kind of navigating right now. I completely agree. We're more about quality of jobs rather than just hiring 10,000 people in a huge plant. And you mentioned Lenwich. We don't want to compete with them. We want to be much, much better. Our food is much better than that. But that joke aside, the goal for us now is really to grow. We know catering-wise, we're not scalable. It's not a scalable model, right? We're not looking. That's part of why we're not seeking VC money. It's not something that you could just it grows. The more we're selling, the more we're going to need to hire people. There's no hockey stick model that's at play here. And we're fine with that, right? It's still a very viable business. It's still a business that could easily support 40 to 100 families, right, in New York only, and we're very happy with that. As long as those are quality jobs where people are invested in the business, we're completely fine with that. We do, however, have ambitions for scale. That's not necessarily in catering per se. So right now, that's part of why we're fundraising today. We want to pilot a couple things that could actually help us go to a more scalable model. Clearly keeping with catering at the very center, so catering will always be our bread and butter. Or pita and hummus, maybe. So that's always at the center. This is it's a safe, growing. But it's not we don't necessarily need that to go crazy, but we are exploring a couple other verticals that could either be product development or long shelf life products, or maybe individual meal delivery. So we're looking at different models that could help us scale. Those are models that won't necessarily have as much of an impact. The impact will be a bit different. So developing products, for instance, that would go to a co-packer. It's not going to be a model where we're hiring, I don't know, 30, 40 people in New York anymore. It would be one, but there the impact is on one person who is the whoever's product is out there, that would be their ownership. So that's one person who kind of becomes an entrepreneur and kind of owns that brand, if that makes sense, right? So we're looking at different ways of scaling impact, also with different models of scaling. But for now, I completely agree with you. Catering is kind of...
There's a question right behind you there.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. I've been nodding vehemently. My neck hurts. I'm program director for Middle East at Building Markets, where we support SMEs affected by various crises, and in the Middle East, that means the refugee crisis. And with PRM's generous support, actually, we work with Syrian-owned and local SMEs in Turkey, and recently in Jordan as well. So, from economic contributions to what that means for sort of social cohesion and understanding between the host communities and the refugee communities, to like the challenges that you've talked about, the perceptions that hinder access to investment, access to markets. Those are the types of things that we work on and try to address. And a big part of our work is I guess where Stefanie, you mentioned where the businesses reach the SME level, and then they need business development support and need the B2B sort of introductions to help them grow and create more jobs. So we work with companies, but also the international development sort of sector and the international organizations as well in expanding their supplier networks to include refugee-owned companies. So I was just curious, sort of maybe more to Stefanie, what you have observed in terms of both IRC and sort of other colleagues in the field in working with the SMEs started by refugees. So that sort of, we double that impact, right, of like both serving refugees and do that by working with Syrian suppliers or the refugee suppliers.
Sure. So actually, another of the challenges that we often face in the refugee context is this friction between refugees, especially ones that are starting to rebuild their lives and becoming successful business owners or whatnot, and the local populace who is somewhat still in status quo and feel like there are things being taken away or opportunities taken away from them. And so more and more intelligent donors, like I think PRM is among these, are actually asking us to target a mix. So maybe it would still, for example, be majority, refugees, so maybe a 60-40 split or something, but making sure that some of these development funds at least are supporting value chains and businesses that are from the host community as well as the refugees, right? And when we're able to do that, if it isn't like, if it's a setting where you don't have, the Syrian refugees encamped or something and never the twain shall meet, when there's people living alongside each other from two different countries, which there often is, especially in the Syrian response, we would like to do joint trainings when we can, get people seeing that they have the same entrepreneurial challenges and that, hey, this Syrian is trying to start a transport company, and there are these, Jordanian, farmers or manufacturers that, lo and behold, need transporting of their goods. So then it becomes, this supply chain perspective that it's synergistic, and the smaller micro businesses can grow together. And a lot of it, I think, this is where organizations like Building Markets, who we have worked with in many contexts, are more specialized in this as well. And oftentimes we have partners like that, or bring smaller agencies on as subcontractors, essentially, to deliver key parts of larger projects, or say, hey, year 3, all systems go for you now to take these forward.
Great. I'm just going to punt back to you. You have the last word, because we're just closing in on the end of the session. What would be the one thing that you could give advice or coaching to this audience? A lot of you guys are probably budding social entrepreneurs, right? Or impact leaders or entrepreneurs within your own organizations. What word of advice can you give them to, A, either get involved in supporting displaced people, and or perhaps that is getting involved and engaged in your own organization?
Since we talked a lot about perceptions, I will start with that. For me, really, it's about, and I think that's something that I personally have felt, and a lot of our chefs have also felt, we would love it if people start by just seeing us for who we are before they see us for the status, right? Or for, you know, being an immigrant, being whatever. So just try to see people for who we are. In our case, we're chefs. We're bringing you food. Hopefully you will try it soon. We're just like taking that extra step in looking at people beyond whatever status they are in or whatever. Is that what you were looking for?
And if you have anything with your organization in particular, feel free to throw that out there. Are you looking for interns or people who work on projects?
We are looking for one intern.
Okay, there you go.
We are also looking for companies to cater to. So if you know of anyone, any office managers I need to connect to, please let me know. I have discount codes right now, so I could give you that.
I can plug their food. They've catered for IRC events. It's very good.
Ours too. Stefanie, same with you. One thing that the audience could do to get engaged with either your organization and or displaced people in general, that they can do now?
I actually just want to say within the sector, I really, really liked Manal's comment saying, for those of you at least who are in school here, I am like bowing down and so and in such admiration of those who are able to take this step to launch a social enterprise. Here or abroad. So if you're considering it, it's true the stakes are lower now, especially if you're going through school. And the great thing about entrepreneurship in general and social entrepreneurship too is you learn so much so quickly. And if you fail after a year or two, it doesn't matter, because employers and others will think it's cool that you still learn so much and you can apply those skills anywhere. So you know, really, like, if you have an idea or if you know someone who does,
go for it.
Go for it. Or get involved with an organization that's newer, that exists as an intern, or look for those roles. You know, IRC is the more traditional employer. And sometimes people come to us from more traditional, like, MPA backgrounds or, you know, Peace Corps or something like that. But that's not the only pathway. We often have internships that get posted on our website, rescue.org, on the careers section, which are a nice way in. And, you know, just reach out on, you know, I'll be happy to have my contact info shared. Reach out to me, reach out to folks on LinkedIn. There's just a lot of different parts to a larger organization, no matter what your interest. If you're a marketing and communications person, we've got teams for that. If you're someone who does have more international experience, or like has an economics or employment background like me, we have a whole department on that. People find their place. We've got an internal strategy unit. So definitely, like, look for the opportunities and look, you know, network to those of us who work in different parts of the organization, because people flip back and forth a lot in this sector too, from small organizations to large ones to other large ones to small ones. I worked for a 10-person NGO before IRC, which I think has like 15,000 employees globally. So just explore a bit, and the humanitarian and development and social entrepreneurship sector is probably a lot more forgiving and expecting of different career steps than a lot of other sectors.
Thanks. Let's give it up to both Manal and Stefanie. Thank you all. And thanks for your questions.